Thank you, Jamie, for that very kind introduction, and it largely inaccurate, but that's okay. I've really worked hard at getting that reputation as being an SOB, and you just demolished it in about 10 seconds. I mean, decades of hard work have gone by the wayside. Well, thanks. I'm supposed to talk about America's challenge, which it was sort of like this morning I went to the Jackson panel. Some of you may have been there, and the title of it was Jackson Then and Now. And John Meacham said that he vaguely remembered having emailed that title in from somewhere in the back seat of a car someplace. So I feel like the America's challenge is similarly broad. So with Jamie's advice and counsel, here's what I propose to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are, and then I want to talk about where we really ought to be focused, and then answer or duck your questions. We really are in a weird place as a country. It's not the first time we've been here, but we are at a place where our politics seems broken and where we're undergoing a moment of populism. I talked about it in the previous panel a little bit, so I'll shorten my remarks for those of you who are here, but we really have gone through a period of 15, 16, 17 years in which trust in our institutions of government has been declining. And particularly after the financial crisis, there's a belief on both the left and right that somehow or another the relationship between the ordinary person and the government has been broken and needs to be rebalanced. On the left, it's the big boys, the banks and the billionaires are getting their piece of the action, and the little man is getting screwed, and we got to rebalance that relationship in order to take them from those who have too much to give to those who have too little. And on the right, there's a belief that the government is in bed with people who have a loophole in the law and a lobbyist in the Capitol, and somehow or another they're taking money out of the pockets of hardworking Americans and giving it to undeserving institutions, whether it's the big banks or Solyndra or somebody. And these concerns have grown worse, and they're not just economic in nature. There's a sort of an economic populism which generally is seen on the left, but it also exists on the right. But there's also a cultural populism, which believes that somehow or another the country, on the right, the country is moving too rapidly, changing too much, is going to become something that it wasn't in the past, and on the left that the country is not moving fast enough, and that it's got to reach its true nature and is being held back by forces that somehow or another have gotten too much influence over things. And this leads us to a tribal moment, and we're in a tribal moment. If you're a Democrat and your leader is attacked, whether you agree with your leader or not, you defend him. And if you're a Republican and your leader is attacked, and you could defend him regardless. And the number of people who are truly pliable in an election, the true independents who who swing from one side to another, has been shrinking for the last 30 years, but particularly the last 15 or 20. To where in the last election, less than 1 out of every 11 Americans was truly undecided as they came down to the close of the election, or weakly linked to the choice of whom they had to vote for. And we had, as a result, a two-stage weird election in 2016. The primaries on each side. 17 mostly accomplished people on the Republican side, including the governors, proven governors of the second and third most populous states in the union. And it gets won by a guy who's never run for office before, who promises to take a brick and throw it through the plate glass window and upend things in Washington as they are. In the previous panel, Ann Applebaum made the point that Hillary Clinton was a candidate of the status quo, and that's right. If you thought the country was going in the right direction, you voted for Hillary Clinton by a margin of 89-8. The only problem was that was only about 32% of the country. And the rest of the people, the 60-some-odd percent, who thought 66, 67% who thought the country was going in the wrong direction, voted just enough for him in order to elect Donald Trump president. On the Democratic side, I mean, that was an unbelievable primary. I mean, she had lost to President Obama in 2008, but the party was united, the president was behind her, and yet Bernie Sanders, who has never made a mark in his years in Congress or in the Senate, suddenly becomes the darling of the hard left of the Democratic Party, gets 47% of the vote, and raises $230 million by sending out emails and tweets and never attending a single fundraiser. You ask Senator Danforth here how many fundraisers he had to go to, and it'll bring on PTS. But here's a guy who raises hundreds of millions of dollars by simply being, and comes in with 47% of the vote. And then we go to that unusual general election where it turns out the Democrats have achieved the impossible. They have nominated the one person in America who can lose to Donald Trump. In this election, 18% of the electorate thought neither person was qualified to be president of the United States. That's the highest percentage I've ever seen in any presidential election of people who think that neither person is qualified to be president of the United States. And they voted overwhelmingly for him because he was change. This is also the election with the the lowest percentage of people saying they'd be comfortable if the other side won. We've had this great tradition in our country. No matter how strong the feeling was, it was like, if my guy loses, I feel reasonably comfortable the country will be in good hands with the other person. But in this election, it was an all-time low of people who said if the other side wins, the country will be all right. And as a result, we come into the general election where Donald Trump, 37% of the American electorate says, I like him, I think he's qualified by experience and temperament to be president, and he's a candidate of change, and I'm voting for him. I have favorable opinions about him, and I'm voting for him. And 9% of the electorate says, I don't like Donald Trump. I don't think he's qualified by experience, temperament, or qualifications, but he does represent change, and I hate her. I'm voting for him. And as a result, with 11,000 votes in Michigan, 22,000 votes in Wisconsin, and 44,000 vote margin in Pennsylvania, every one of those representing well below 1% margin, he becomes president of the United States, becoming the 5th person elected, having received a majority in the Electoral College and a minority of the popular vote. He's had, as a result, little or no honeymoon. Part of that is self-inflicted. He's also the first president in our history, the history of the modern age, when we had polls, never to get to 50% approval. Never. Not one day. His high mark was the day after he got inaugurated, and his next high point, close to that, 1 point or 2 points below, was after the first so-called summit in Singapore with the little rocket man. Yet, he's had authentic successes. The animal spirits of American commerce was unleashed simply by his election. Small business confidence, consumer confidence, hitting big levels, high levels that we haven't seen in decades. Regulatory relief that started almost from the beginning by stopping things and then not doing things more, that caused people out in the real world to say, I want to invest in jobs and plants and equipment and enterprise. Tax reform. I'm sort of skeptic on the personal side of the ledger, but if you had told me that there was a chance that we would become, we were the only industrialized country in the world that didn't have a territorial tax system. So if you made a product in the United States of America, so let's say you were GE and you made a piece of medical equipment and sent it to Germany and made a profit, you paid a tax in Germany on your profit and then brought it home. If you wanted to bring that profit home to the United States, you paid a second haircut. But if you were Siemens and sold a piece of equipment here, you paid a tax on the profit here, you could take that money home to Germany without a second haircut. We had the highest corporate tax rate of almost any country in what's called the OECD, the major industrialized countries, and we were the only one without a territorial tax system. So there we are trying to compete on the international stage with every American worker having one arm tied behind their back, and we changed that. And as a result, these kind of things caused us to grow economically. Think about this. 2016, economic growth, the GDP in the entire year grows 1.5%. We were told that was the new normal. That's how America was going to grow, slow growth. 2017, 2.3% growth. That means growth increased 50%. Growth for 2018, quarter 1, 2.2, quarter 2, 4.2, quarter 3, 3.5. Estimated for the year is going to be above 3.3. That means we're growing twice as fast as we're growing in 2016. And that means a real difference to a lot of people. That's not just a number. That means a job. That means a paycheck. That means some confidence in the future. That means being able to take care of your family, maybe take them on a little vacation, put some money aside for retirement or education. As a result, we have unemployment 3.9%, I guess it is. We'll know tomorrow what it is, as of today. And historic lows, lowest African-American unemployment rate since we began keeping track of those numbers by race in 1948. Latino unemployment low. Lots of people who have only a high school education now entering the workforce. Workforce participation climbing back up because people finally say, you know what, I'm sitting on the sidelines because there's no opportunity for me, but now there is. Conservative judges, 2 members of the Supreme Court who will serve for a long time, are well-accomplished, thoughtful jurists. And then some changes which nobody's paying attention to, which can help on health care by markets and competition and choice. And then we look abroad. Look, here's the guy who's supposed to be, sort of soft on Russia, and we have the toughest sanctions we've ever had on Russian and Russian oligarchs and Putin's buddies. NATO, every president has worried in the modern era about how the hell do we get our allies to live up to their commitment. We have Ambassador Tim Timken, who served during the Bush administration as our ambassador to Germany. He can tell you how painful it is to tell the Germans, you need to do your fair share. And I didn't, particularly like the way that he went about doing it, but by God, it had some action. And now we see our NATO allies doing what they need to do, which is to step up to the bar and start spending money so that they can be part of our common defense in Europe and around the world. The Iran nuclear deal, pulled out of it. Promised he would and did it. Said, I'm going to move the embassy to Jerusalem and did it. And still maintain close relationships with with Jordan and Saudi Arabia and our other allies in the region. Syria, when he said, within the first couple of months of his time in office, the Syrians once again used gas on their people. And some reporter says to him, does that break the red line, cross the red line with you like it did with President Obama? And I got to tell you, I was watching the news conference, and when he said, it crosses a lot of lines with me, I said, here we go again. Here we go again. Something bad happens, and we say it crosses a line with us, and then President Obama did nothing about it. I happened to meet in 2016 with one of those infinite number of Saudi princes. Have no idea what number he is number 578 in the line of succession. Well-educated, impeccable English, wanted to understand American politics. We had a lovely conversation, and at the end of it, we got to talking about the state of the world. And he said, I want to congratulate the United States of America for what you have achieved in the last few years. You have achieved the impossible, and I want to congratulate you on it. I said, well, what's that exactly? He said, you've convinced both the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the State of Israel that you're a completely unreliable ally. And I'm sitting there thinking, when I'm watching President Trump answer that question, saying, oh, God, here we go again. Once again, our credibility being sawn off. And yet, not too many hours later, 98, I guess it was, cruise missiles come launching off of American vessels in the eastern Mediterranean, and in a matter of a few moments, 1/4 of the Syrian Air Force is destroyed. And you saw those pictures. Those little bunkers about the size of this stage, and inside is the Russian-built fighter, and the fighter is gone and the bunker still remains. It says something about American technology. NAFTA. Okay, look, I cannot say MCA without seeing the Village People. And it was not a major redo, but it was an update. And NAFTA needed to be updated because when we wrote it in 1992, the internet and e-commerce was zero. And the Mexicans were never going to be willing to allow American investment in the energy industry. And financial services was not really a big centerpiece of it. But we've updated it now with a lot of fanfare and a lot of side damage, but gotten it updated. And then South America, finally paying attention to the neighborhood and working in concert with our allies. When the administration endorsed the provisional president of Venezuela here the last few days, we did it in concert with and after it had been done by the leaders of countries like Canada and Colombia and Chile and Argentina and Paraguay and Brazil. And it was the right thing to do. But having said that, the jury's still out on North Korea and China. And I do have concerns about how we're treating our allies and our friends and about the idea of withdrawing prematurely from Syria and Afghanistan. But the point is this. He does a lot of things, and some of them conservatives and Republicans can applaud, and maybe some people who are not Republicans and conservatives would applaud if he talked about them and spent less time tweeting about Meryl Streep's acting ability. But I must admit, I am really down on where we are in American politics right now. Because we have a contract. So first, the president made the mistake. Do not shut the government down. We have a $4.4 trillion enterprise, and saying we're going to take 1/4 of that offline and not run it in a proper fashion is an irresponsible thing to do for the leader of the United States of America. Great countries should not, must not, and cannot do that kind of thing. So that was a mistake. But then we get embroiled in an unnecessary controversy over something that ought to be done. Now, look, I am the biggest advocate of comprehensive immigration reform. I was there in the White House for 3 years, bleeding over the issue in 2005, 6, and 7, as we worked with McCain and Kennedy to pass a comprehensive immigration reform law. So I don't need to prove my bona fides and be in favor of immigration. But there are parts along the southern, and then look, I spent plenty of time during the campaign mocking President Trump for suggesting we needed a big, beautiful wall all along 1,954 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border, because we don't. In Texas, we got the Santa Elena Canyon, 150 miles in the Big Bend of Texas. The U.S. border is about 1,100 feet up in the air. It's a canyon. The Mexican border is about 750 feet up in the air. Where are you going to put the wall? You want to keep that one Mexican from climbing down 750 feet, coming across the river, and climbing up 1,100 feet, and then saying, oh, God, I got another 30 feet to get up. I was rewarded for this intemperate set of remarks that I put into my column in the Wall Street Journal by having the future nominee of the Republican Party stand up for 20 minutes in Dallas, Texas, and spend 20 minutes ripping my sorry ass. I'm sure a lot of people in the room said, who the hell is this North Korean Karl Rove? I mean, what's the matter with that guy? But the president is right. When Kamala Harris this week in Oakland says the wall is immoral, prove it to me. Introduce the bill that calls for the removal of the border wall in San Diego County between Mexico and the United States. Tell all those people in San Diego that you don't want a wall that keeps people from walking in a neighborhood in Mexico across the street into the United States, and instead forces them to go to a border crossing to come across. Please do that. When you do that, I think then you're shooting straight with me rather than just paying stupid politics. And the amount of money the president wanted was $5.7 billion. That is 1/10 of 1% of the entire federal budget. And we're going to shut down the government rather than getting in a room and saying, okay, it's not going to be $5.7 billion, it's going to be $3.7 billion. And we know you're going to scrape together $900 million more by retasking money inside the Department of Homeland Security. But in return, we want to get an answer to the problem of the Dreamers or the TSP or both. This is how it's supposed to work. But it's broken, and it's broken because we don't have adults in both parties. I know Nancy Pelosi wanted to go out and show that she was in charge and strong, but by God, she did a disservice to our country. We got 1.5 million people. We have 1.5 million people sitting out there saying, I was brought to the United States as a child. I know no country except the United States of America. And my status is up in the air, and because you wanted to show that you were strong and could defeat Donald Trump in a political battle, my status is still unknown. I'm one of the several 100,000 people who are granted temporary protective status because I came from a country that suffered a horrible natural disaster, or I'm a victim of an internal conflict like in South Sudan that is almost beyond human understanding. You gave me refuge in a moment of distress for my family, and my status is up in the air. And because you wanted to look strong, my status is still questioned. So look, President shouldn't have gotten us in the shutdown, but by God, everybody has a responsibility to resolve this problem in a way that makes sense for the future of our country. Now, strong message to follow. Not that anybody's listening, but now we're facing 2020. And that's what this is all about. This is all about pre-positioning for 2020. I wish to God's sakes that we could find a way to say, okay, we're going to penalize people who spend time on politics the year before the election instead of the year of the election itself. Maybe we are, because in the shutdown, Nancy Pelosi's negatives rose faster and further than Donald Trump's did. Maybe there was some good common sense of the American people saying, okay, Nancy, seriously, I'm a Democrat, but get it done. But now we're facing 2020. And Jamie said, talk to you about 2020. Like I've got the turban on and the little thing here, and I'm Johnny Carson, and I'm the great, holding the thing up. Who the heck knows what's going to happen? I can tell you this. The president's job approval today is, in the Real Clear Politics average, is 41 approve, 55.5 disapprove. On the approval side, his entire time in office, he's floated between 37 and 44 approval. That's a very narrow range. His disapproval is also narrow, 52 to 58. What that means is people are dug in about him. Quinnipiac, January 11th, 33 strongly favorable, 50 strongly unfavorable. Fox, 12-11, 27 strongly favorable, 42 strongly unfavorable. So not only are the president's numbers wrong, but the intensity's on the other side. Now, his reelect is 38 in Fox. Someone else, 47. Actually, it's 55, someone else, 47 strongly someone else, 7% likely someone else. But I'd remind you this, nothing is locked in stone. At this point in 2010, Barack Obama's reelect was 43. How did he get reelected? He did three things. A little bit of new policy, DACA in the summer of 2012. Talked about what he'd done a little bit more, and then spent most of his effort disqualifying Mitt Romney. And my suspicion is that we're likely to see Team Trump do a little bit of new policy, maybe talk a little bit more about what they've done, but spend most of its time trying to disqualify whoever the Democratic nominee. In other words, we're going to have a positive, optimistic, and uplifting campaign. But the president starts out somewhere between that, in my opinion, somewhere between that 38 reelect and the 44% approval that he has been able to get at some point. That's his start. He coming out of the starting gate, that's where he is. Where are the Democrats? I don't think they're at 55% who say I'm voting for somebody else. Because at the end of the day, they're going to say, wait a minute, that person? No. I'd rather have the one that I got than that one. But the Democrats do start out ahead. Because I think the base is the 43% of the American electorate that says, I want to impeach the guy. And I think the starting point is somewhere between that number and 50% who say, I strongly disapprove of him. So they got an easier game getting across the finish line than he does. On the other hand, they can overplay their hand, and they did. We saw it in Kavanaugh. I'm involved in a super PAC called American Crossroads Senate Leadership Fund. We raised $195 million and spent it on the Senate races. If any of you got your checkbooks with you, I'm having American Crossroads, just write out a big check. But I could see it in the polls after Kavanaugh. It just was a reaction out there to the unfairness of it that caused a lot of people to say, I'm now going to come onto the field and I'm going to vote for the Republican candidate for the Senate. And some of these close races like we had in Indiana and Missouri, North Dakota, Florida, they either became much stronger or moved into good territory. But both parties are sort of screwed up right now. Not only are they structurally weak, but both of them seem intent upon appealing to their base. They seem to have forgotten that their bases are sort of there, and particularly in this environment, and that the real election targets have got to be the people who are weakly linked to their choice or up for grabs or looking desperately for something better. Now, the Republicans may have a primary, but if President Trump runs, he'll win because we're in a tribal moment and people will flock to him. If I were sitting in the West Wing, however, I'd be a little bit nervous about the recent polls. For while the president's job approval is in the mid to high 80s, we've now gotten to a point where a third of Republicans don't want him to run again. I see this as I travel. People come up to me and say, God, I love what the president's done on X. And I say, well, how do you feel about the tweet? Oh, God, I wish he would stop doing it. And that's going to, over time, have a corrosive effect unless he changes how he's handling himself and what he's doing. On the other hand, the Democrats. We thought we were in trouble when we had 17. They could have 20. And not only that, but politics is fundamentally changing so that there are going to be a bunch of things we need to think about and watch in the next year. First of all, don't pay attention to national polls. All they are is sort of a whose name is been out there that week. Kamala Harris zooms up because she's announced. Later on, somebody else is going to zoom up when they announce. or that we already know you. Without going out on the campaign trail, Joe Biden is going to be near the top of the Democratic polling heap for the rest of the year because, well, we all know old Joe. But we're going to start to see some things that are going to be worth watching. The Democrats begin their debates in June, which means by June, everybody who wants to be considered a candidate is going to be in there so they can get the free publicity of the debate. And how do you put 20 people on a stage? Perez says, I'm not going to have a junior debate and a kiddie debate and an adult debate. We're going to figure out how to do it all together. Well, good luck with that. I'm looking forward to it. But the debates are going to be a moment where people say things in such a way that designed to grab people's attention. And how that plays out is going to be interesting. Social media. If you're running for president, hell, when I was running the campaign in 2000 and 2004, we were worried about it. 2000, ABC, CBS, NBC, and occasionally Fox and CNBC and MSNBC. And we were worried about how do you get on that channel? How do you have an image on that channel and stay in touch with your voters by being in the news? Well, think about it now. Sure, you get to worry about those, but you also get to create your own direct channel of communication with your voter. You get to have your Instagram account, your Facebook page, your YouTube channel, your the whole kit and caboodle, your Twitter feed. All of those people you get to feed. And you get to talk to them whenever you want to talk to them. Why do you think Robert Francis O'Rourke, whose nickname I refuse to say, why do you think he's going around the countryside right now? Because he knows that if he gets his teeth cleaned, a bunch of lunatics, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, will watch him on his social media feed. Because he's got a direct channel to talk to them. So what happens? Normally we go through a process where we winnow out people. They can't raise enough money. They can't keep enough interest. They can't keep enough enthusiasm. They begin to lag in the polls. What happens if you can inexpensively communicate with a vast number of people whom you've collected and energized anytime you want to with something interesting? We're going to have candidates who may not be viable, who stay in this race a lot longer because they've got a base of several 100,000 people who are loyal enough that they send them 10 or 15 bucks a month and give them enough juice in the tank to stay in the contest. Early states. Iowa comes along. We're going into Iowa 2016, and Hillary Clinton is leading the national polls dramatically, strongly. And then comes the upset in Iowa by Barack Obama. Doesn't guarantee him a win in New Hampshire a week later, but it does vault him to the top of the polls. Are we going to see this, not when we got essentially 3 or 4 candidates, but are we going to see this if we've got 15 or 20? I don't know, but it's going to be interesting to watch. March 3rd used to be sort of a ho-hum date in the primary process. Now it's going to be the date that you have a lot of southern states and California and Texas. What happens on March 3rd? The momentum of somebody in the early states, they won Iowa, they won New Hampshire, they broke through in South Carolina. But what happens if they're not from Texas or California and March 3rd comes down and somebody, Kamala Harris wins California big and Robert Francis O'Rourke wins Texas big? Does that then stop the momentum of somebody who might have won in those earlier states? Proportional. The Democratic rules are far more proportional than the Republicans. If you're in Texas and you get 3% of the vote, you get 3% of the delegates. So what happens if we've got 15 or 20 people plus highly proportional rules and big contests early, so we have candidates who get votes out of Texas or votes out of Georgia or votes out of Florida or votes out of California and aren't anywhere else? I bet you this is the first Democratic convention since 1952 that goes to multi-ballots at the convention. Because the proportional rules may mean that, some of these candidates have got 20 or 30 delegates or 40 or 50 delegates or 100 or 200 delegates, and nobody, as a result, has a majority on the first ballot because most of the states not only have proportional rules, but they bind you to that for a number of ballots. And finally, my favorite thing. The Democratic Party is the only political party that I know of that has its own House of Lords. We call them the superdelegates. And they said this time around, we're going to crimp their authority. They don't get to vote on the first ballot. So what happens if it's a multi-ballot convention and on the second ballot, suddenly on the horizon appear 700 grandees of the Democratic Party who were made superdelegates when they attended the 1840 convention that nominated James K. Polk, or they were a campaign advisor to Franklin Roosevelt in the 44 re-election campaign, or they were an advance man for John Kennedy in 1960, and they became a superdelegate then. These people have been around for decades, and what happens on the second ballot when 700 of them come screaming in to a multi-ballot Democratic convention? This could be nirvana for every political junkie in America. Mark it on your calendar. Then we're going to go to the general election. And it's going to be one heck of a contest potentially, because it's going to come down to an even smaller number of battleground states in all likelihood. Ohio may no longer be a battleground. Timken has finally received his vision of Ohio returning to its solid Republican roots. But we're going to have, you can bet every town and county in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania is going to be covered up by candidates. The Democrats are going to be going after Iowa and Georgia and North Carolina and Arizona, and the Republicans are going to be retaliating by trying to go after New Hampshire, Nevada, Minnesota, Maine too, and Colorado. And as I say, the starting gate is it's difficult for the 45th president unless and until the Democrats nominate somebody on the far left of American politics. Because the danger for the Democrats is they could nominate somebody like that. You may have seen this piece that was today in the Wall Street Journal this morning. I strongly commend it to you. It's on the op-ed page. Insightful, well-written, really concise, full of a lot of information. I think I did a hell of a job with it myself. Amen. But Medicare for all sounds great. But 56% say, you know, we like that idea. Support drops to 44% if you start calling it socialized medicine. Drops to 37% if you say your taxes are going to go up, and incidentally, you lose your private insurance coverage, and 26% if it leads to delays. So a lot of these things that may sound good, like free college or the guaranteed job or the universal basic income, may sound good to the Democratic base right now, but it ain't going to be good long term. Now, let me quickly say, I've wasted too much time on the current. Let me just say, none of this is as important as what we're missing a conversation about in America today. And that is three big challenges. One is entitlements. Medicare is going to go belly up by the actuaries say in 2026 the hospital trust fund runs out of money. The problem is that the average American working couple by the age of 65 today will pay $160,000 in Medicare taxes, and over the course of their lifetime after that, take out an average of $468,000 in benefits and pass $326,000 on to our kids and our grandkids. That is simply unsustainable. Social Security actuaries say that the trust fund will run out in 2034. Now, at least when they passed that in the 1930s, they defined what would happen if the trust fund goes belly up, and that is benefits must be cut overnight to match the income stream, which means everybody on Social Security gets cut overnight 24%. Now, everybody in this room can probably get by, but there are a lot of people for whom Social Security is their only source of income, and having their income cut overnight 25% is not going to cut it. And the only way that we could solve it, if we acted today and said we're going to solve it by simply keeping the current system in place, we would have to do one of two things. We would either have to raise payroll taxes 25% effective today, or we would have to cut the benefits for everybody 21% today in order to keep it from going out of business. So we got a problem. And there's an answer for it. And the answer is to be found in a solution advocated by one of Jack Danforth's great friends, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and a reform commission that reported in 2004 that called progressive indexing, that says we're going to keep the promise to everybody at the bottom of the scale that we made, but if you're Warren Buffett, you're going to get a Social Security check that's in purchasing power only as good as it is today. Because one of the dirty little secrets is the way we formulate Social Security benefits uses a concept called accelerated wages. You may think that if the average benefit today was $13,000 and you retired in 2050, that you'd get $13,000 adjusted for inflation. You'd get $22,000 in today's dollars in 2050 because of the way we calculate the benefit. So we're not just giving you inflation, we're giving you inflation plus. Then we got the problem of deficits and debt. On January 20th of 2009, The public debt of the United States, securitized in the form of a bond and sold to somebody with all of our names on it, was equal to 40% of GDP. This morning, it's 78% of GDP. And within a very short period of time, several decades, it will be more than 100% of GDP. We'll be in nosebleed territory like Greece, and no European Union to bail us out. And the problem is fundamentally an issue of spending. There's a new CBO report out forecasting the next 10 years. Today, federal government spending is equal to 20.8% of GDP. For the last 50 years, it's averaged 20.3% of GDP. So already we're about half a point above the average for the last 50 years. By the end of the decade, it will be 23% of GDP. On the other hand, revenues, which today are equal to 16.5% of GDP, the 50-year average is 17.4, so because of the tax cut, they're below. By the end of the decade, they'll be at 18.3% of GDP. So they'll be above the average, and we will have a deficit still of 4.7 trillion, or 4.7% of GDP. So we got to rein in spending, grow the economy faster, and we can't do it by simply reining in the spending in the discretionary side of the budget, which today is less than a third of the budget and growing smaller every single year. We have to have structural reform of these mandatory programs, and that's politically difficult and dangerous to do when both parties seem intent upon exacting political revenge from their opponents if they talk about it. But then, and you've heard some of these panels, so I'll gloss over it quickly, China, Russia, and Islamic fundamentalism. These challenges, some of them are relatively recent, some of them are very old, but all of them are new in their methods and goals. And we ought to be talking about these things rather than talking about, we ought to be quickly resolving the issue of $5.7 billion for a barrier on the southern border. Anyway, let me take a few moments to answer questions, and sorry to have prattled on for so long right here. Would I care to comment on the Howard Schultz situation? We're a two-party system. More power to them, but it's hard to get on 50 state ballots. And at the end of the day, Ross Perot had 19% of the vote and 0 in the Electoral College. But I'm glad he's in there because he may force both parties to sort of realize that the people they're competing for are exactly the people that he's speaking to, who say, I'm not that far out on that side, I'm not that far out on that side, but I want the system more than anything else to work. Over here. Yes, sir. Why did I think the intelligence service said Iran is not that big of an issue? They actually didn't say that. What they said was very narrowly targeted, which was that the Iranians are continuing to comply with the Iranian nuclear deal, and that they're not developing nuclear weapons beyond their current capability. And I think that's for two reasons. One is they know that there's a clock on that, and eventually they can reinstitute that weapons program. But more importantly, they're an economic disaster, and they need European investment and Chinese investment, and they need consumer goods, and the way to get that is to continue to comply with this agreement, try and rebuild their economy. Because look, at the end, it's the economy, stupid. Carville was right with one thing, and if they can't feed their people and give their people a sense that they have a better, more prosperous future, even that regime is at risk. Right here, and then we're going to go back there.
Are you confident in your assertion, I think you said, that there's not a realistic chance of a primary against Trump?
Yeah,
I would have thought.
Yeah.
Just the embarrassment factor.
Yeah.
And people like you, who 2.5 years ago were saying, 2 years ago, that he's a terrifying moron, and you're now saying, I don't like him much, but he's accomplished it.
Yeah, well, that's not exactly. Yeah, two things. One is he said, is there a chance of a real challenge to Trump? And the second of all, he was saying, it was said that he was a moron 2 years ago, which I did say, and now I'm sucking up to him. But the answer is I'm calling balls and strikes. And but the answer to the first one is yes. If the Mueller report has something far more damaging than I think it's going to have, yes. Is there a crisis that happens and he mishandles it? Yes. Does by sort of the steady application of people's concern, does that third that says we don't want him to run grow? Yes. But today, I don't see the person, and I don't see those conditions coming to pass. But what the heck? I was wrong about him being able to get elected, and he could get reelected or not get reelected, and both of us would be wrong. Yes.
How do you feel about the UNICEF?
How do I feel about what?
The UNICEF survey that just
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm not familiar with the survey, but I generally have a very bad allergic reaction to anything that the United Nations issues in the way of a formal declaration or report on the status of the world. When, when, when the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations is chaired by representatives of not just authoritarian regimes, but totalitarian regimes, I'd rather be judged by somebody other than the United Nations. Sorry to be so blunt. Yeah. Anything else? One here, and then I'm going to close by exercising Speaker's prerogative and ending on an optimistic note. Do I think Trump will shut down the government? And my answer is no. I think he will be forced. There will be a bill come out of the committee that he will sign and claim partial victory for, and he ought to claim partial victory for. But no, I don't. I think inside the White House political shop, they recognize that there's too much of a bad thing. Even they understand that it was a bad thing.
Why do the Republican Party not get together like the Democrats are? Why don't they?
Why don't the Republicans get together like the Democrats? You haven't been watching those Democrats too closely. They're controlling it right now because it's easier to say no than to say yes. But let me just say this: we are broken, and what the Democrats are doing on this thing is just, in my opinion, ridiculous. But as much as we talk about how bad things are, recognize they've been this way before. And we're not as bad as we've been before in many respects. Think about everybody in this room, I suspect, remembers 1968, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73. Our country looked like it was coming apart at the seams. I'm writing a new book for Simon & Schuster, title unknown, on presidential decision making. I'm looking at 6 big consequential decisions and looking at what did that president know at that time and how did that work their way through. The election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson must have been, God, author of the Declaration of Independence, father of the University of Virginia, Secretary of State, Vice President of the United States. God, one of the great figures of our country. He must have been enormously popular. The election of 1800 ends in a tie in the Electoral College. Did you know that? On December 3rd, when the members of the Electoral College meet, back then you voted for the president and the vice president separately. Well, actually, you voted, the vice president was the second guy. Whoever came in number 2. So if you were Jefferson, you would expect that some of your electors would throw away their vote on the vice president and vote for somebody else. Then, in this case, Aaron Burr. And he thinks it's going to be some guys from Georgia who are going to take care of this problem for him. But they don't, because Aaron Burr, knowing how close the election was, thinks he has a chance to snake it. So it ends in an electoral tie between Thomas Jefferson and his running mate. In third place is John Adams, and in fourth place is Adams' running mate, Pinckney of South Carolina. Remember the 31 days from hell in 2000 and how our country was riven over that? Congress meets in the middle of February 1801. The House of Representatives has to decide the election. They meet in the midst of a blinding snowstorm. Each state has 1 vote. Maryland is 4 Democratic Republicans and 4 Federalists, but one of the Democratic Republicans is ill, and if he fails to show up, Maryland will go for Burr, who is now the semi-official candidate of the Federalists. So he insists upon being carried on a pallet through a blinding snowstorm for 2 miles in Washington, D.C., and installed in a committee room next to the House floor so that he can vote. They vote starting at noon and cast nearly 30 ballots by noon the next morning. They vote straight through the night, and every vote is exactly the same, inconclusive. They talk about it and work over it for the next 6 or 7 days, and finally, Alexander Hamilton weighs in. He says, I hate Jefferson, but I also hate Burr. And Jefferson at least has some character. And he tells Baird of Delaware, given a choice between 2 evils, go for the lesser every time. So Baird makes himself absent, basically canceling Delaware's vote, and convinces a colleague of his from Vermont to make himself absent so that the Democratic congressman from Vermont can cast its ballot for Jefferson, and Jefferson is elected President of the United States after 37 ballots and nearly 10 days of debate, and he is sworn in less than 2 weeks later. And you go to the Gilded Age, which I studied for that brilliant book, The Triumph of William McKinley, and you think politics today is broken? You think politics today is broken, Senator? During a debate in 1884 on a tariff measure that fails, one member of the Democratic Party stands up and excoriates a fellow Democrat in such personal terms that the offended member finally says, Mr. Speaker, the member is violating the decorum of the House. And the Speaker says, the honorable gentleman from Georgia is out of order. And he turns to his colleague and said, I will not blank you if you were a dog. 4 letters. We have a period in 1889 through 1890 in which not a single bill is passed in the House of Representatives for nearly 4.5 months because the Democrats announced they will not answer the roll call and thereby deny the House a quorum. So no business can be conducted. This is not, we're going to shut down the government unless you repeal Obamacare. This is, we don't care what you want to do. Nothing is going to pass because we won't answer the roll call. Some of you may have heard me tell this story. Thomas Brackett Reed, the Speaker of the House, plans on one particular day to end this. He has sergeant-at-arms lock arms in front of every door, and unbeknownst to the members of the House of Representatives, he has barricaded every door to the House floor on the outside. At the end of the vote, somebody calls for a quorum call. They call the quorum. Democrats don't answer. Quorum does not exist. And Reed says the chair directs the clerk to show Mr. Jones present, Mr. Smith present, calls out the name of every Democrat on the floor of the House and directs the clerk to show him present. And what happens? All hell breaks loose. They run for the doors. Of course, the sergeant-at-arms have locked their arms. Only one member of the House gets out. Constantine August of Rusk County, Texas, beats the crap out of the sergeant-at-arms and uses his cowboy boots to kick out the slats of the door and make good his escape. One Democrat stands up and screams in anger at Reed. He says, under God and the Constitution, you have no right to count me present without my permission. And Reed says, the chair is merely stating a fact. Does the honorable gentleman from Kentucky deny he's present upon the floor of the House? For 2.5 more months, this is wrangled upon in the House and finally settled by the U.S. Supreme Court. And in the meantime, for 4.5 months, no bill gets passed. Opening day of the debate, another Texan makes a contribution to the positive spirit of the times. William Henry Martin, 6 foot 6 inches tall, thin as a rail, mean as a snake, fought the entire Civil War with Hood's brigade, stands up and points his finger at Reed and says to his fellow Democrats, if any member will order me to remove this dictator from his position of power upon the podium, I will do so by force forthwith. Reed says, the honorable gentleman from Texas is out of order. The next day, Martin shows up, takes out his 16-inch long Bowie knife, sits in front of the Speaker of the House, and methodically sharpens it on his boot sole in order to menace the Speaker. I don't remember Pelosi doing this in 2011. I just don't. We've been here before. We'll get out of it again. Thank you.